never give a single price. Think about creative ways to give at least 3 and make your obvious choice your bottom line.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
Man, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the oftentimes relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving, and our guest today is Nathan Yeung. Here are 3 things you want to know about Nathan before we start. I love his LinkedIn banner. It reads, I help B2B companies discover revenue. He's a VP of CMO Services at Find Your Audience marketing partner. He's a fractional CMO, and he's a health optimization freak. Welcome, Nathan.
Thanks, Mark. I know the last part's funny.
If the last part was an insult, I want everybody to know he told me those words, okay?
I think a lot of people look at me funny when I talk about my diet and my regimented bulk and cut cycles that happen at least once or twice a year. And people go, why do you do that? And I go, well, I'm just going to say this to start. When you learn how to bulk and cut the first time, you feel like it's a fluke. The second time you go, oh, maybe this isn't a fluke. And then the third time, Mark, you were just talking about how you like to enjoy life. Now when on my bulking cycle, I can enjoy all the food without feeling any of the guilt because I have this control now that I know I can lose it on the third time. So as much as it's crazy, it's like all the anxiety and the guilt from eating's gone. And I love that.
Nice. Well, let's see if we can get rid of some anxiety and guilt around pricing for a second. And let me ask you the ultimate question. How'd you get into pricing? Or do you even think of yourself as being in pricing?
I think pricing, as you know, you go to school for it. If you ever went to marketing or if you took a business class, it's the 4 Ps. It's right then and there. And I think pricing plays such a huge role in terms of framing and anchoring of products and positioning. And pricing also comes down to value. How do you value yourself? A lot of, I call myself a fractional CMO, but the reality is I have a firm. So not only do I just do it, but I also have teams that help execute. And people go, well, do you charge hourly? Do you charge it on project based? How do you do that? Pricing plays such a huge role in marketing. It's hard for me to get around that. But the science behind it, the strategy, the psychology behind it, I think is so complex. And I think a lot of people have a hard time trying to understand that, which is why I think they default to hourly, just like, oh, we'll do hourly pricing, but they don't recognize how much you're shooting yourself in the foot by doing that. And also how much it pigeonholes your business. Just in terms of even how you negotiate or even how you sell, it pigeonholes you so much.
Yeah, we could talk about hourly for a while and why it's so horrible. But I'll tell you, the number one thing I hate about hourly pricing is that it puts you at odds with your customer, because your customer wants you to bill fewer hours and you want to bill more hours. And every time you say, hey, let's talk about health on the phone today, they're thinking, are you charging me for this? So it just ruins the customer relationship.
It's too bad lawyers don't listen to that advice.
It really is. It really is. Okay. So I said this in the opening, and I truly am. I love your LinkedIn banner. I help B2B companies discover revenue. Now, I love that because I think of pricing is probably much bigger than most people think of pricing, but I want to hear from you. What do you mean or how do you go about discovering revenue?
I think a lot of businesses try to reinvent the wheel because there's so many shiny objects. And if you think about it, my job as a marketer is to make that object so shiny that it actually grabs your attention and forces you to want to do something. And I think we're almost at odds to ourselves. Marketers, we do such a great job where we get a bunch of CEOs wanting to do new things. But at the same time, as a marketer, we also know there are ways for you to maximize low-hanging fruit and really focus on those things. And a great way that you can do that is, Mark, you talk about pricing, incremental price increases a year. You see that in all luxury brands. There's a reason why they do that. It's, in other terms, they call it limit testing, right? If you never limit test your price, you actually never recognize how much your market is actually willing to spend on your product. And so therefore you sometimes get stuck, right? So many of the companies that I work with practice that. And that's an easy way to discover revenue. When you increase your prices 3% every single year, it's immaterial at the end of the day to your customer, but to you in the long run, it's very, very much material. So that's a great way of discovering revenue. Discovering revenue in another way is just creating pricing packages. I think often I talk to a lot of service-based providers, and when they're selling their service, they're only selling one package. And I go, why are you doing that? And that's because, well, that's the service I provide them. And I go, look, I get that. You're probably correct. But if you don't give a consumer, your potential customer, choice, you don't recognize how much more you can charge. Mark, I don't know if you've ever come across this, but there's that whole negotiating thing where you never want to accept someone's first offer because it actually makes them feel bad, right? So when someone goes, I'm going to pay you $2,000, and you go, yes, the person who just made that offer actually feels bad because psychologically they feel like they've gotten hooped, like they didn't do a good enough job. But if you give them choice and you allow them to make that choice, not only do you have an opportunity of them being more happy after the transaction, you also have an opportunity of potentially making more money because you've given them that choice. And I think that's another way of discovering revenue. So outside of pricing, though, there's tons of ways. Sometimes I talk about.
I don't know what I want to say. Although I've heard the studies and I kind of agree with them, I have to tell you, when I tell someone my price and they say yes, I'm happy. I'm really happy. Right?
I think some people fall under that immediate sense of, oh my gosh, I could have potentially gotten more if they agree to it too quickly. Like, oh, it's $5,000 to go. Yeah. You go, oh, could I have done 5,500? Could have done 5,750.
So here's how I interpret that. If I ask you for $10,000 and you say yes, really fast, my next client, I'm asking for 12,000.
Fair.
That was just a learning experience. Thank you. I appreciate it. Right.
Yeah. It was in a negotiating book. I can't remember which one it was. But I always found that interesting, but going back to, I think there is so much learning experiences around price. And I think you just pointed out a great one. When someone accepts so quickly, you should probably ask yourself the question is, was that too low? Did I sell just better this time? Is that how much value I'm creating? Is there more value I can create? What is the value of that? And I think, there's definitely a learning to increase your price. Exactly what you do, Mark.
Yeah. So I love what you just talked about is selling value. And so I want to bring that up for a second, because I would expect that one of the big ways that you help discover revenue is you help find the right clients by communicating value properly, or you help train salespeople how to communicate value properly. Let me let you blather on that topic for just a second or two.
I think it's interesting because when we come out of school, we kind of learn to talk a certain way, and we kind of forget that people are human. And when you forget about that, you get a lot of people locked into this state of logical thinking. And when you're too logical, it's actually hard to generate a lot of value, because when they're logical, they're being highly critical. And so really understanding your ICP, your ideal customer profile, sorry for using acronyms, and really understanding their true pain points and understanding where they are in a business, you can understand value. And so there's a difference between a feature that generates a quantifiable, observable change for the positive impact of their life. So whether that's increasing conversion rates, increasing marketing qualified leads, increasing sales qualified leads, whatever number or KPI you want, and the true value to them, which actually could be that, but it's actually the outcome potentially of that. So if you talk to a VP of marketing and you said, hey, I'm going to double or triple your MQLs this year, is the value that, or is the value the outcome that they get from that outcome? Is that what's most important to them? And I think that's why value is such an interesting conversation, because value makes you really be empathetic. And you really have to understand what is valuable to your customer, because just because there's a quantifiable change that is valuable, that does not necessarily mean that person values that the most. So understanding value is so important, because if you don't do that, then you don't know how to price that well, right? And that's why some things are so invaluable. They're priceless, right? And that's why, a lawyer that says, hey, you could hire me or you could hire so-and-so, but what if I could tell you, 99% of the time I end negotiations with your partner within 2 weeks. And that means you have peace of mind. Everyone wants the divorce to be over with. That's an easy value add, right? That's a value outcome that everyone wants. But that peace of mind is actually probably the most valuable thing. The fact that after 2 weeks, that individual no longer needs to think about this incredibly painful thing in their life. And so that's why I think value plays a role. If you don't understand the highest value, which may not be the one that you can measure the most, it may be an outcome or an actionable item that happens afterwards, then you'll have a harder time understanding how much they're willing to pay for that.
Yeah, I thought that was a fabulous answer. Let me add some nuance to the first answer you gave, if I may. And that is, you talked about in the world of B2B, right? I'm going to increase MQLs. So MQL is a result we get from having a product or feature or capability or something like that. What's the real value? And I think in the world of B2B, value is measured in incremental profit. Right. So how much more profit did I make the company? If I could double your MQLs, does that turn into double the revenue, or does the conversion rate change? So if we could turn that into incremental profit, that makes it really good. In the second example, in the B2C example, oh my gosh, you can't do that. Right. How do you measure incremental profit of a divorce or a breakup? Right. So you just can't do that. And so now it's what intangibles are most valuable to the client. And so I think that's the hardest part.
No, that's great addition to what I said. And I'll add one more thing. So my business was actually, it started off as a value creation engine. And the reason why I said that was because I wanted people to stop thinking about marketing as purely an MQL, SQL activity. I wanted people to look at the fact that marketing can unlock value within the organization in multiple different ways. And you just brought up a great point, Mark. But the other ways that I have worked with companies is, a lot of times you have HR teams create internal communications. And if you think about that, it's kind of silly. HR is great for compliance and process and all that kind of lovely stuff, but they're really not great marketers. And so this idea of building culture, while it's important for HR to take care of that and be the accountable part of that, the reality is that marketers are likely the more important person to actually bring that message to market, which is the company in itself. And so I once had a conversation with a private equity firm. I said, if I could decrease your turnover by 40%, how much does that, what's that value to you? Right? And they kind of fumbled over themselves because I brought in a angle of marketing that they never thought about. And we all know that, or there's a lot of stats out there where the average cost of losing an employee is like 5 to 7 months of their salary. So it's pretty sizable for most organizations. So I could decrease it. Doesn't that kind of pay for myself? Right. Other ways that you can generate value is by increasing the efficiency of the sales team. And they go, what do you mean by that? I'm like, well, let me know, like, how good is your sales team actually in organizing their marketing materials and keeping them up to date? Well, probably not very good. I was like, okay, well, what if I could make them 10 to 20% more efficient? What does that mean? I'm not contributing to an MQL right now, but I'm contributing to your operations, which is kind of a part of my background is in operations. And I always try to educate, but the problem with this, Mark, and so this is my now putting back my marketing hat. The reason why I go revenue generator is because there's less education required, but you're absolutely correct in the sense that marketing in itself can generate value in an organization in more than one way. But the most well-known way is MQLs and SQLs and revenue. If I start talking about how I can decrease turnover, people get really confused. And then it becomes an uphill battle. And that's not a battle that I want as a marketer.
Right. And by the way, I've never heard of marketing taking on the role of HR's communication. But by the way, I think it's brilliant, right? But the idea of having marketing do the internal communications for a company is pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it's simple if you think about it. Like, our job is to communicate and to sell. And if you think about internal communication, the whole point is to increase consumption. If you increase consumption, it means more people are aware of the policies, the insurance programs you have, the benefits, the culture of the organization. So if you're just, busting out this text formatted, non-copywritten culture piece, your uptake in consumption is probably going to be pretty low. If you make it fun, vibrant, and essentially like an ad, you would expect higher uptake. You'd expect actually people to remember it more. So therefore, if they remembered it more, they'd likely be able to practice it more. They practice it more, you'd assume culture would be better. So this idea where you have a bunch of HR people communicating en masse to sell a message doesn't actually align.
Yeah. Okay, so let me change topics briefly. So you're a marketing guy, marketing expert. Can you tell me why most web pages suck? I have an answer, but I want to hear yours.
I think most web pages suck because I think most companies hate the idea of being hyper-focused on a single page. And that's where essentially you're losing people. And I think the one thing that we also have is we have spotlight syndrome. We all have spotlight syndrome where we think that the world is viewing us every day, that for some reason, let's just say I'm a SaaS company that sells to legal, that founder for some reason feels like every single major law firm is opening up their website every single day to read about them. But that's not true. They'll get maybe a couple visits, a day, and maybe if there's an interest, they'll see it. And so there's this constant fear of, if I don't talk about everything we do, we're going to lose this opportunity. And the reality is all you end up doing is you end up being a bit like a Chinese restaurant that's serving Italian. You're going to piss off the Italians and you're going to piss off the Asians because you're doing neither good. So that lawyer who ultimately comes to your webpage is going to see your lovely offering, but they're not going to see the depth required to fulfill that need that they have, right? And so therefore they'll graze over it and they won't be convinced, and no trust will be developed amongst you and your potential customer. So I think that tends to be the issue. It's this one is most owners and entrepreneurs have an overconfidence bias in themselves. So therefore they think that they're right. So they'll think that having a general message is important. So that's probably why it sucks. And then two, they're not marketing experts and they're not willing to actually look into the detail of the fact that in order for someone to trust you, you have to be incredibly empathetic, which means if everything on that webpage doesn't hit, in that user's brain kind of a trigger, they're not going to feel like you know them very well, which means they're going to have to spend more time trying to figure out why they should trust you, which means they'll just either leave the webpage and think you suck, or, if you somehow grab them in another part of your funnel, you get another opportunity to educate them. And most entrepreneurs will be like, oh, well, no, it's more important that they know everything that we do. Well, that's wrong, right? That's like, you're never going to go to a neurosurgeon who also is an ENT doctor, who's also an ophthalmologist, who's also doing, braces on the weekend. There is something really uncomfortable going to a doctor that does all those things because you want a specialist. That's all we ultimately want, cues that imply that there's a high probability that they will serve our needs. And when you're a generalist, you don't get that benefit. So I think that's why most people suck, because we're overconfident and we think general works better, and therefore we do that.
So by the way, I agree with everything you said, but I'm going to add one more. And that is, I think that most companies have the curse of knowledge. And so they think they can list a product or product feature and everybody knows what that does for them. And what they completely forget is that our customers tend to be novices. They don't know our products. They don't know as well as we do. And so we're not speaking about the customer's problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you put it much more simply than I did. But you're absolutely correct. Now, I will say there are some industries where that isn't true. Like manufacturing software for sure. A lot of people are very technical already. And that's where it gets really even more confusing as to how does your homepage look like when you're speaking to such a technical user?
Right. And so you have to know who the audience is.
Exactly.
I know a company that's called something like that.
It was funny. That's actually how we came up with our name, right? We came up with this. It was like, why don't we just call it Find Your Audience? Like, to find the people that matter.
And so, let's talk about that for just a second. In the world of pricing, one of the things that the companies do a lot is we charge too low prices, and it's because we're afraid we're going to lose a deal. And I often think, well, why don't you just sell to the people who want to pay you more? Isn't that your real audience? So how does that fit with the way you guys do business, or do you?
So I think that a lot of that falls into the maturity of the business, Mark. And I think it also falls into kind of just well-known strategy, I think, within operations. And what you've said is absolutely correct, right? So that's why you look at private equity funds and they'll be like, hey, we don't work or do any deals that are not, any less than $100 million. Because deploying $100 million versus deploying $5 million, the amount of work required to do the diligence, doing the operations, it's all the same. So to them, it's like, hey, I'm only going to deal with operations at $100 million because that makes sense at our scale. And so when you're starting off, it does make sense to take that $500 a month client because you're starting off and you have no idea and you're just trying to be hopeful. And then there's the point where you start realizing, well, that $2,000 client that I just landed the month later is actually the same amount of work. And then you go, well, why am I working with that $500 when I work with that $2,000? So I think a lot of that is also just that learning experience and the maturity of that business. And also positioning. I think a lot of times people don't recognize that if you don't charge enough, you don't actually have enough margin to deliver that level of service that is required, which is where I have a saying, it's like the middle is where you go to die. And it's a positioning conversation, not only in pricing, but also in market positioning and just general qualities and features. And I tell a lot of companies, they're always like, oh, there's an opportunity in the middle. I want to be that person who provides high level service, but at a mediocre price. And I go, yeah, but then if you look historically, and you know what, the recession right now, COVID is all great examples of that. All the companies that are on the extreme ends of the spectrum did well. All the companies in the middle got squeezed. Yep. And there's a reason for that. And I think pricing and positioning plays a huge role into your operations, and you don't recognize this until you get squeezed. But there's a reason why you charge low, and your operations are fundamentally built around that. And there's a reason why you charge high, and your operations are built for that. And typically when you charge in the middle, your operations does not usually operate very well because you're trying to do something without room to breathe, or you're doing something that's just not really that economical or too risky. So then you end up getting squeezed out. So I think charging a lot, if you want to provide that level of service, should always be what you should be looking for and what you're striving for, because the level of service that is required is the same as that $500 person. But if you're doing the $500 person, you just have to recognize that you need to change your operations to meet that model.
Yeah. You've got to have the system in place that says, look, I'm not really spending that much time with you.
Yeah.
So to my solopreneur friends out there, let me give you a quick hint. Something that I always teach is that charge whatever rate you want to normally charge. And when you get to where you're working 30 hours a week, raise your rate. Right? Because it's totally okay to lose customers and win the next customer at a higher rate.
And also, don't be ashamed that you have to do the smaller contracts. I think some people are, and I go, look, everyone starts somewhere, and you need case studies. You need proof, right? So the three prongs of FY's framework is trust, operations, and strategy. And on the trust part, it's what are you doing so that people trust you? Because that's really the fundamental part of marketing. If my marketing doesn't increase trust, then I'm not doing a good enough job. So if you don't have any customers and you're not known in that industry, you have to do something to prove to someone that you're capable of achieving a desirable outcome.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I'd never heard before that empathy creates trust. I like that phrase that you used earlier.
So I'm writing a book. It's called the Lazy Consumer. Hopefully it'll be published by the end of this year. And I say hopefully because I have a love-hate relationship editing it right now. And a part of it is what does trust really mean? And in Harvard, there's actually this lovely triangle that says trust is made of three prongs, which is logic, empathy, and authenticity. And Empathy, I thought, was so interesting because when you think about it, empathy means you're actually talking in their pain points. And if you actually take empathy and you go and you translate that into what does marketing do that actually represents empathy, it's actually being able to talk about those benefits in such a way that it is impactful to that user, which basically is actually empathy. If I can say, hey, I know how much this divorce is hurting you, but I know it's not the divorce that's the most painful. It's how long it drags out. That's more painful. And then you see that person go, oh, you're right. You know what? We've already been through the hard part. This isn't the hard part. The hard part is the fact that I have to keep having this conversation now every week. And it just nags at me, right? And that's what's really eating at me. And that is actually empathy, because now you're talking to someone, you're saying, hey, I actually know what's really bothering you. And I am showcasing that I know what actually is your biggest pain point right now without you telling me. And that is a form of empathy. And so if I can demonstrate that in a product, that means I feel like they know me, which means I'll generate trust from that.
Yep. I love that answer because I'm often working with my clients to figure out what problem do you solve, what result are you going to achieve, and what's the value of that, right? And the place where everybody fails is what problem do you solve? And when you can start to truly articulate that, that's where you get the empathy that you're talking about now, which I think is just awesome.
And I think everyone who's ever done a sales call, I think if you just think about this very intuitively, you know that customer switches as soon as you say something that triggers a switch in their brain, which is likely an empathetic comment, right? Oh, I know that, turnover costs you a lot of money. And they're like, why is he talking about turnover? It's like, it costs you like $70,000 every time you lose an employee. He's like, oh, he's right. Right. And then you go, well, that's probably pretty expensive. You're a $2 or $3 million company. You lose 2 or 3 employees. That's $210,000 a year. How does that feel? And he's like, yeah, it sucks. That's empathy, right? Every time you can talk in the fact to talk in their shoes about their pains, that's empathy. And typically when you do that, you'll always see a switch in that individual. And that's because they're actually starting to trust you. They're like, oh, he gets my, they are getting my problem. They actually know how to articulate it. So therefore I have trust that individual likely can come up with recommendations that will fix those problems. Okay.
Let's bring this back to pricing for a second. If someone trusts you, will they pay you more?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That was like the softball there.
Oh, that was, the easiest thing in the world. Mark, I have a client that has given us their full marketing budget, including how much they pay us. So I could hypothetically increase my rates if I wanted to, but he trusts me, right? So he knows I'm like, look, I'm going to pay myself the rate that I need to get paid. And the rest I'm going to use prudently to achieve whatever KPIs he assigns me for the year. And it's the most optimal situation. I charge too much, I get fired because I don't have enough budget. I charge too little, I don't perform, I get fired. So it's my job to self-regulate and ultimately perform for them. And it's the best situation, right? We deal with almost a $400,000 budget a year, which my retainer comes from. And he goes, the oyster's yours, Nate. Just you go figure it out, but just know you get fired if you don't perform. And it keeps you honest, but it also allows me to charge more if I really wanted to. And so trust plays a massive role. And if you think about it, in every single major relationship you have in life, trust does that, right? It gives you that ability to allow a person to do, because you're going to get your desired outcome, or you have a lot of trust that it will happen.
Yeah. We're going to have to wrap up, but let me ask the question I always ask at the end. What is one piece of pricing advice you would give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
I said this at the beginning, never give a single price. Never give a single price. Think about creative ways to give at least 3 and make your obvious choice your bottom line. So meaning if you want to earn $5,000 from a contract, then design something where the obvious choice is $5,000 and anything else is gravy. And that's what I would do.
All right. Nathan, thank you so much for your time today. If anybody wants to contact you, how can they do that?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Nathan Yeung, spelled Yeung, or you can find me on our website at www.findyouraudience.online.
Perfect. And to our listeners, thank you for your time today. If you enjoyed this, would you please leave us a rating and a review? And if you have any questions or comments about this podcast or pricing in general, feel free to email me, Mark at impactpricing.com. Now, go make an impact.